Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Iran and the GCC countries have a long history of suspicion, cooperation, competition, conflict, and dialogue. During the fallout of the Arab Spring in 2011, we saw intense rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which saw both nations sponsoring different sides in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. We also see close cooperation between them. Despite sanctions on Tehran, the United Arab Emirates is a key trading partner and a place for Iranians to do business. However, the Israeli war in Gaza and Lebanon, the fall of Assad in Syria, and the new Trump administration in the US means the GCC and Tehran are in choppy new waters. What are the implications of these changes, and how will leaders across the Gulf respond to one another? Helping us to understand all of this is Mehran Kamrav. Mehran Kamrava is a professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. He is also the directs the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Kamrava is also author of a number of journal articles and books, including most recently How Islam Rules Iran, Theology and Theocracy in the Islamic Republic. That's Cambridge University Press 2024. Righteous Politics, Power and Resilience in Iran, also Cambridge University Press, but in 2023. A Dynastic History of Iran from the Qajars to the Pahlavis, also Cambridge University Press 2022. Triumph and Despair in Search of Iran's Islamic Republic, Oxford University Press 2022. The pattern is broken there. A Concise History of Revolution, Cambridge University Press 2020. Troubled Waters, Insecurity and Persian Gulf, Cornell University Press 2018. Inside the Arab State, Oxford University Press 2018, and The Impossibility of Palestine, History, Geography and the Road Ahead, Yale University Press 2016. Mehran Kamrava, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you very much. It's good being here.
So just before we sort of get into the sort of meat of our conversation, it's interesting to sort of place you a little bit. So you obviously have a long track record of producing a lot of high quality, excellent studies on Iranian politics.
Thank you.
What makes it even more interesting, I think, for our audience perspective, is that you now do this while teaching and working in the Gulf. And so I sort of wonder, you obviously have students there and stuff. What is it, the Gulf countries, the students that come to you, when it comes to studying Iran, what questions interest them? What are they sort of pursuing with you? And is there like a difference between the sort of questions that are being asked from if you teach in America, for example?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. A lot of the students that come don't really know about Iran. Also in the US, they don't know about Iran. And so on the one hand, there's this kind of Iran as a mystery, while on the other hand is the image of Iran as a source of instability, as a source of sectarian politics, as a source of exporting the revolution. And so as a result, there's a number of question marks that students come with, and it makes for a very interesting learning experience and for them, and teaching experience for me. It's been an incredibly rewarding experience for me to interact with these students, to deconstruct their preconceived notions of Iran and to reintroduce them to Iran the way that I know Iran, or the way that I think Iran ought to be introduced.
Do you feel there is despite the fact that there is obviously a sense that they don't know much, there's a mystery, is there though a keenness to sort of learn about what Iran is from your students in the Gulf?
Absolutely. There is definitely a sense that Iran is intriguing. There is also often an awareness of the lack of detailed or precise information about Iran. A lot of our students here in Qatar know from their own personal experiences that the image of a country as portrayed in the media, as portrayed on popular news channels, is not consistent with reality. And so there's definitely an eagerness to really get the real story about a country like Iran.
And so to finish up here as well, Is there sort of a parallel thing with Iranian students and their interest in the Gulf, as far as you can tell?
I don't really know because I don't teach in Iran, but I think it's fair to say that there are as many misconceptions outside of Iran about the country as there are inside the country about the outside world.
That's very interesting. So now this sort of brings us nicely into what we're going to be discussing today, which is obviously in the last year and a half, let's say, we obviously had things like October 7th, Hamas strike on Israel. We had the subsequent Gaza war, but we also have, let's say, in that year, in Israel, which was much more unrestrained in its attacks on, you know, countries across the Middle East, Iran in particular, but also Lebanon. They're striking Syria now and all the threats that come with. Also, you've got now a US Trump administration that has come in. So, in the last sort of 17 to 18 months, let's say, how do you feel the situation, the discourse, the way policymakers think about the region in Tehran, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi in particular?
Um, Osama, I think there is a lot of misconception, and there's a lot of apprehension. Of course, what we saw over the last 5, 6 years, particularly actually even dating to nearly a decade now, we've seen progressive breaking down of trust and relations across the world, but particularly in the Persian Gulf region, have become far more transactional rather than ideological. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of this particular transaction? And they've become bilateral as opposed to multilateral. So, for example, organizations like the Gulf Cooperation Council have declined in significance and influence, whereas bilateral relations between Saudi Arabia and the UAE or between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, those are the relationships that have become key and have become important. So policymakers across the region are taking kind of a very cautious approach. And of course, now, for the last couple of months, we've had a very unpredictable administration in office in Washington. And nobody knows precisely what guidelines are going to be guiding the objectives and the policies of the Trump administration. So my sense is that everybody is kind of taking a deep breath, trying to anticipate the move and the policies of the other one, and in the meanwhile, not necessarily trying to rock the boat too much. Every side is trying to forward its own objectives and its own interests without necessarily creating havoc or kind of creating waves that might in some ways result in more unpredictability in the regional environment.
So this transactional view of bilateral relations and bypassing let's say, regional cooperation councils and that kind of thing, would you say that's a characteristic of the post-Arab Spring fallout, or did it begin before?
It is, in some ways, it had actually started, the trend had started prior to the Arab Spring. But I think the highlight of it was 2017. It was indeed during the so-called blockade of Qatar, or the Gulf crisis, where we had Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain impose an embargo as they saw it, or a blockade as the Qataris saw it, on Qatar. And so what we saw was kind of this withering away of Gulfi alliance or Gulfi fraternity, and instead the emergence of these very transactional relations and bilateral relations. And of course, the zenith of that, the most perfect example of that is the Trump White House. And kind of that, in many ways, the Trump White House has taken that trend to its logical extension or extreme extension.
Indeed, indeed. And also, and also we sort of see as well, don't we, that in sort of the last few years, I mean, different Gulf countries. You've mentioned the siege of the boycott of Qatar, but even across the region, we've seen different Gulf countries take different policies to different issues, which of course changes the way, they sort of relate to each other. I mean, of course, you had the war on Yemen, which impacted relations between Saudi and Iran, but it also impacted relations between Saudi and the UAE, with United Arab Emirates effectively backing different forces within Yemen from the Saudis, which caused conflict between them. So it was a very messy time in a way in terms of relations because you had colliding interests. But my sort of sense from what I can tell is, especially with the bringing to the end of the Yemen war between Saudi and Yemen, I feel like in the case of Saudi, the way it sort of relates to the countries around it changed as a result of ending that war. Is that your sort of sense as well?
Absolutely. One of the historical trends we've seen is that, for example, the Gulf Cooperation Council has come together as a collective regional organization, or either collective diplomatic organization or a collective security arrangement. They have come together at moments when there's been a common identifiable enemy, whether that enemy was Iraq or Iran in the 1980s, and then Iraq in the 1990s, or Yemen for a brief period in 2015. And then we see kind of each side pursuing, or each country pursuing its own foreign policy, its own national interests. And that unity that had come together in moments of crisis has withered away and has frayed. And so we're in that moment when there's no overarching common enemy. There's a realization that Iran is not going away. So first we saw United Arab Emirates improve its relations with Iran. Then we saw ultimately Saudi Arabia and Iran normalize their relations. And so when the Iranian enemy had morphed into something else, and when the Houthis had become facts on the ground and could no longer necessarily be militarily defeated, when Saddam Hussein was gone, in those times we see that the unity that had characterized the Arabian Peninsula in particular has frayed and has withered away.
My question now is about foreign policy making and culture, because there's always this question mark about how is foreign policy even made in many of these countries. I mean, there is a sense, isn't there, like within, let's say, the West, there's this idea that you have like a large diplomatic corps, you have foreign ministers, and you have an entire like think tank bubble around that, and there's a sort of back and forth about how to develop policy. Of course, presidents and prime ministers can effectively do their own thing, but there is that sense. But with places like Saudi Arabia, let's say, it's not always clear. There's always, at least in the Western way, it seems, there seems to be a lack of clarity about how foreign policy is made and who is making it and what the role of the foreign ministry even is. And something similar exists in the Iranian case, because there is a sense that foreign policy is effectively in the hands of Ali Khamenei. He gets the final say on a lot of things, but you do still have a large foreign ministry, diplomats as well. And then running parallel to that, you have the RIGC, which also directs certain policies. So could you perhaps just sort of explain to us how foreign policy is even made and the structures involved?
Yeah, in either side of the Persian Gulf, foreign policy is made very differently. As you mentioned, in places like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, for example, foreign policy is really made based on the emir's vision, or the ruler's vision, the primary ruler's vision. And one of the things that we have seen is that each of these leaders, whether it's Mohammed bin Salman or Mohammed bin Zayed or Sheikh Tamim of Qatar, they have a very clear vision of where they want to take their country, how they envision their country's role in regional politics and in global politics, and what they perceive to be their interests of their country. And that leadership is surrounded by a very narrow circle, a very small number of advisors. Those advisors include the different ministers with strategic portfolios, foreign minister, minister of energy or petroleum minister, and a very small number of trusted advisors or family members, sometimes brothers, prime minister, foreign minister, kind of a very small foreign policy circle. That smallness gives these countries, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, tremendous agility, and they can either respond to crises or more often create opportunities and capitalize on those opportunities. So, for example, we saw that in relation to Syria, as everybody else was standing, scratching their heads, trying to figure out how to modulate their foreign policy in relation to Syria, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the emir went, and so, I think what we saw, kind of a rapid response to either crises or capitalizing on opportunities, particularly because foreign policy circle is so small and there's such a clear vision. So, of course, there are some problems with that. Sometimes you can act on impulse, be impulsive. We saw, for example, that Mohammed bin Salman did a lot of that impulsive action in his early years in office. The war on Yemen, the blockade of Qatar, elimination of opponents abroad, not all of which turned out to be in Saudi Arabia's national interest. But at least there's that built-in agility and there's a sense of vision that guides. And that vision, of course, is informed by assumptions about national interest. In Iran, the institutions and the structure of policymaking is slightly different. As you mentioned, there is a bigger foreign policy establishment. And then there are different stakeholders. There's the diplomatic core that is answerable to the president and is part of the executive. There is the security apparatus, which is headed by the Revolutionary Guards. And then the supreme leader, Khamenei, often has his own objectives. And all of these interests, these stakeholders, come together in something called the Supreme National Security Council, which is the ultimate decision-making body when it comes to foreign and security policy in Iran. And the Supreme National Security Council is a very key institution in Iran, which is often misunderstood or overlooked. And it is made up of the president, the heads of the different branches of government, head of the judiciary, head of the parliament, head of the expediency council, head of the assembly of experts. It has 2 representatives from the office of the leader. It has all the key commanders from the regular armed forces as well as from the Revolutionary Guards. And that's the ultimate decision-making body out of which foreign and security policy comes. And of course, their deliberations are often guided by the supreme leader's thinking. But you can imagine that within that institution, there's an awful lot of bargaining, there's an awful lot of bureaucratic give and take, there's compromises, there's who can push their agenda more successfully. So, and that decision making, what we have seen historically, tends to be slower. It's not as agile. It doesn't enable Iran to respond in a timely manner to crises. Even less, it allows Iran to create opportunities. And so the decision making is slightly different. The procedures are slightly different in each case.
So now could we let's sort of zoom in a little bit and talk about relations between Iran and the other countries. In particular, I want to start with the United Arab Emirates. So the United Arab Emirates and Iran, it's an interesting one to look at because on the one hand, we see there are disputes between them. Historically, there are the islands and the Gulf, which both countries claim. Also, the United Arab Emirates is on the other side, or when there was the Arab so-called Middle Eastern Cold War in the 2010s, the UAE was meant to be on the other side. Also, the Abraham Accords, which puts them on the opposite side. But at the same time, the UAE has always had a slightly different policy towards Iran when it comes to things like sanctions. So a lot of Iranian money flows through the United Arab Emirates. As I also mentioned in the introduction, it is one of the key business areas for Iran is Dubai. If you want to, I remember when I visited Iran, obviously as an international, they sort of said to me, if I wanted to buy a expensive carpet, you send the money to Dubai, and then it gets to us there. So it's obviously a key transactional point. So I'm sort of wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about this kind of relationship and how to understand all of this.
Yeah, before I talk about Iran and the UAE in specific, let me just say that both the UAE and Saudi Arabia at some point discovered that they can get more mileage out of normalized relations with Tehran rather than adversarial relations. And so what we saw in 2014, particularly 2015, 2016, was kind of a breakdown of relations and tremendously adversarial relations between Iran on the one side and the UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other. And then there was this realization that when these guys, the Iranians, are under pressure, and when you go toe to toe with them, they become slightly dangerous. They blow up shipping that is docked at the harbor. They attacked Abqaiq, Aramco facility in Abqaiq, and so they become less predictable and more dangerous. And the Emiratis were the first one to discover this, and so they decided to re-establish ties with Iran and normalize relations. So on the one hand, there was this kind of realization that, you know what, Iran becomes extra unpleasant if it's put under greater pressure. And so let's talk to them and let's kind of establish some sort of a modus vivendi in which we have normalized relations. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, as you just mentioned, is the unique demography of the UAE in general and Dubai in particular, whereby there's been a historic and more recently expanding group of Iranian merchants, businessmen, expats, and travelers and tourists that use Dubai as both a center of commerce, a way to get around sanctions, as a place to go for tourism. And so there's this realization that it's both good diplomatically and politically, but it's also good commercially and economically. And so that kind of normalization of ties, reestablishing of ties between Iran and the UAE was kind of a realization in relation to both of these domestic factors as well as diplomatic factors. And topping the whole thing, as you know, UAE and Iran re-established their ties back in 2019. And this was a very clever move on the part of the Emiratis because they knew that in 2020 they were going to sign the Abraham Accords. And so on the one hand, they sought to mollify Iran and kind of make Tehran realize that they're not necessarily aligning themselves with Tel Aviv against Tehran, but they're establishing diplomatic relations with Israel nonetheless. And so in some ways, it was a very clever diplomatic move by the Emiratis to reestablish ties with Tehran.
So before we sort of move on to Saudi, could you perhaps tell us a little bit about, as I sort of mentioned, when we're speaking about this, how important is the UAE and Dubai to Iran economically and for the business community in Iran? Just how big is this thing?
Oh, tremendously important. Some years ago, I'm not sure what the exact number is now, but some years ago, there were an estimated 400,000 Iranians in Dubai. And it's not just Iranians with an Iranian passport. It's Iranians who are dual nationals of other countries and use Dubai as a center of commerce or as a conduit for commerce between Tehran and the rest of the world. And so it's tremendously important. Also, it's not just the commercial significance of Dubai or the UAE for Iran. What is also important is that Iran also wants to establish diplomatic ties with as many countries as possible in order to be able to counter the isolation drive that the US is seeking to impose on Iran, to say that we do have diplomatic ties, we do have friends in the Arab world, and that we're not necessarily this marginalized pariah state that Washington makes us to be.
It's interesting as well because, as you said, there is an isolation drive from the US. And it's not just something we've seen with Trump, we've seen it in previous US administrations. But for whatever reason, this is what's interesting to me. The UAE seems exempt from a lot of the sanctions, or at least the US seems to look the other way when the UAE skirts them in regards to Iran. So there's an interesting dynamic there too, isn't there?
Absolutely. Look, the Americans are realistic. They know that if there's a will, there's a way. And then they're also aware of necessities and facts on the ground. And they realize that Dubai has had a historic merchant community. It's been an entrepot since before the 1800s, entrepot to the rest of the region. And the Americans do the same thing in relation to Qatar. They realize that Iran is there. It's big, it's giant, it's only an hour and a half away by plane, or half hour in terms of southern Iran, Shiraz, and that barges go back and forth. And there's been this historic commerce, history of interaction and give and take. And so the Americans either look the other way or have sanctions waivers or kind of realize the facts on the ground. As much as they tend to be ideological and doctrinaire, they can also at times be extremely realistic.
We've mentioned obviously a few times about the re-establishment of relations between Saudi and Iran. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that, where we are today with regards to Saudi and Iranian ties, and what is the sort of drivers behind all of this?
Yeah. Well, we have in some ways, a happy convergence of dynamics and developments. On the one hand, Iran has been wanting to reestablish ties with Saudi Arabia. And then on the other hand, we saw a willingness on the part of Riyadh to establish ties with Tehran. And so what are some of these convergence of factors? On the one hand, from Tehran's perspective, they always wanted to reestablish ties. In fact, the very fact that, as you know, relations were broken in 2016 when mobs in Tehran and Mashhad attacked Saudi diplomatic facilities. In Tehran, the Saudi embassy was attacked, and in Mashhad, the Saudi consulate was attacked. And so this was a deliberate attempt to undermine the legitimacy, popularity, and power of the pragmatic president in power at the time, Rouhani, and his foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif. And so Rouhani and Zarif came out immediately in 2018. In fact, they proposed something called HOPE Initiative, Hormuz Peace Endeavor, HOPE. And Rouhani wrote to the King of Saudi Arabia, King of Bahrain, And at that time, there were no takers. So although Iran wanted to reestablish ties and kind of repair ties as soon as possible and as much as possible, the Saudis did not see it in their strategic advantage to reestablish ties with Tehran. Then what we see is a change in Saudi political system, or if not in the political system, but we see a change of emphasis on the part of Saudi political system in general and the person of Mohammed bin Salman in particular, whereby they reduce the tensions with Qatar, reestablish ties with Qatar. Mohammed bin Salman changes his tune internationally and really puts an awful lot of effort and attention to delivering Vision 2030. He puts a lot of his domestic legitimacy on delivering the basic premises of Vision 2030. And one of the ways of doing that is to reduce international tensions. And so then what we saw is in 2023, after a long period of not so secret negotiations and discussions in Baghdad and elsewhere, we saw a formal reestablishment of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, as I mentioned, there were these convergence of factors on both sides that have resulted in a reestablishment and normalization of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
So, I now want to ask you a little bit about what has happened in the last year, because, of course, when October 7th happened and Israel was sort of bogged down fighting in Gaza and stuff, the feeling was that this is somewhat favorable to Iran, that Israel's using all its resources fighting in elsewhere. But then as we sort of got to the summer of last year, we also had huge strikes against Hezbollah. We also had lots of strikes on Iran's own facilities. And so what is the sort of feeling now about how Iran handled this entire crisis with Israel?
It depends on who you ask. I think the Iranian military and political establishment are feeling pretty confident because despite media reports that Israel destroyed Iran's defensive radars and all that, I think what we see out of Tehran is a certain level of confidence that they can indeed go toe-to-toe with Israel militarily if need be. And we just saw last week, actually, we saw the conclusion of these prolonged, very detailed military exercises. And I think the Iranians feel pretty confident. But of course, the military dimension is only one side of the war, because in order to engage in a military campaign and military conflict, what you also need is domestic buy-in and domestic popularity. And that's where the Iranian government feels insecure. If Iran engages in a war with Israel, then the government figures or policymakers are questioning whether or not they can continue on the support of the population. And so that's one dynamic and one factor that goes into decision making in Tehran. And from Tel Aviv's perspective, from Israel's perspective, they feel that, they can hit Iran, but the Iranians can not necessarily be destroyed, and they don't necessarily want to have to deal with the larger international consequences and regional consequences of a conflict with Iran. First and foremost, just as there's no domestic appetite in Iran for military conflict, let's remember there's also war fatigue and exhaustion in Israel, and the Israelis are also worried about their own hostages. So Netanyahu and his administration are figuring that they also cannot necessarily count on the rally around the flag effect if they were going to go after Iran, and that rally around the flag effect would eventually unwind. And the Iranians have also promised that if Iran is attacked, they would attack American bases around the region. Here in Qatar, the Al Udeid base, the foreign minister came and, in no uncertain terms, told the Qatari leadership that if Iran is attacked, Al Udeid is fair game. And so, one question in Netanyahu's mind is that does he want to be responsible for the outbreak of a major regional conflagration and conflict that he cannot contain? And so what we now have between Iran and Israel is a balance of terror. Each side is scared of the other side. And that fear that, look, they cannot destroy us, but they can do serious damage. That fear has resulted in this precarious cold peace that we have, or hot peace that we now have, kind of tensions that characterize relations between the two sides.
So changing tracks now, I want to sort of ask you about, because I mean, as we've sort of mentioned, there's a lot of Iranians living in UAE, and not just the UAE though. I mean, we've got all across the Gulf. And some of them are direct diaspora of people who come straight from Iran. Some are Iranians who have other passports in the West or other countries who have moved there. But also, many Gulf countries do have populations which have historic ties to Iran going back centuries. So what influence does this sort of have on the way policy is made and the attitude towards Iran in the Gulf itself?
There is in the Gulf a deep suspicion of their own Shia population. And although not everybody is as equally suspicious as, for example, the Bahrainis, who during the outbreak of Arab Spring saw the Shia population as Iran's fifth column, but there is kind of suspicion. And so there's this awareness that, look, Iran is there. We ought to have relations with it. We ought to talk to them. We ought to have normal diplomatic ties with them. But at the same time, we don't want to get too cozy because they might agitate sectarian sensibilities. And in the past, during the early days of the revolution, the Iranians engaged in export of the revolution. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen again, that sense is not reawakened among Iranians again.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And so now I sort of want to bring us now to sort of what we think the future is going to be. I know that's a notoriously difficult thing to do, so I do appreciate that. But what do you sort of see as the sort of future challenges and the future opportunities with regards to Gulf and Iranian relations? What do you see as developing there, and what do you think we should all look out for as well?
Well, we have more questions than answers, obviously, but in the short run, we have to look and see what happens in terms of the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the Americans in particular. And I get the sense that Donald Trump is almost desperate for some sort of a nuclear agreement, of course, on his own terms. I think that Trump is really keen on getting the Nobel Peace Prize, and he sees three key goals in reaching that objective: peace between, or some sort of a ceasefire peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and third, some sort of modus vivendi, some sort of closure on Iran's nuclear program. And in that sense, I think he's quite keen on that. The question is, under what terms, and would the Iranians be willing to negotiate with the Americans. So we have yet to see how Iran would formally respond to this letter that Trump has written to Khamenei. As we speak, the Iranians are considering that letter. So that's kind of in the short or medium term. Then, of course, the bigger question is the position of supreme leader. Khamenei is 85 years old, and all of us at some point meet our maker, even if we're supreme leaders. And so Khamenei is bound to depart the scene sooner rather than later. Within the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, Iran is bound to have a major leadership transition. And then the question is, what does that portend for Iran's domestic politics, particularly in terms of that balance within the Supreme National Security Council that I discussed earlier? What does this mean in terms of Iran's relations with its neighbors, its relations with non-state actors in Iraq, in Yemen, elsewhere? And of course, what does it mean in terms of its relations with its other neighbors, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, its larger regional profile? And so I think Iran is kind of due for a major transition in terms of its leadership. And I think we have to kind of watch with interest what happens in that space.
Indeed, indeed. And it's also interesting to note here as well that it was also Trump that pulled America out of the nuclear agreement, and now he wants it again. Perhaps the reason is that it wasn't his deal. Now he wants the deal that is his deal. So I think that's also part of it.
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. And within the Gulf itself, what do you think is the thing to look out for? So with regard to Saudi.
I think within, I think one thing we have to look out for is what is China's relationship, and how does that space evolve in terms of Iran's relationship, the GCC countries' relationship with China. For the time being, China is a free rider. It's not interested in security arrangements. It's not interested in a security presence. It's more interested in investments, in infrastructure. But is this the context and the groundwork for something bigger and larger and deeper in the next 10 to 20 years? Or is this not going to evolve into some sort of a security partnership or security arrangement? So I think, we can count on each of these countries having the same leadership, barring, of course, unforeseen developments like a sudden sudden stroke or heart attack. But for the next 2-3 decades, at the very least, we're likely to see foreign policy in Saudi Arabia dictated by Mohammed bin Salman. Same thing with Mohammed bin Zayed in United Arab Emirates. And of course, Sheikh Tamim of Qatar is also only in his 40s. So what we're going to see is leadership consistency, but I think it's the other factors. I think we have to wait and see. Particularly, we need to watch for how the relationship with China evolves. And of course, that's an interesting space to watch.
Indeed, there's going to be quite a few spaces. China is one of the big ones. Also, we haven't mentioned Turkey at all, and there's also the European Union going forward, but that would be for another conversation. But Mehran, Kamrava,
absolutely,
I would like to thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversation.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
And to our audience who have tuned in, thank you for tuning in. If you missed this one, would like to catch up or watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.